If you were to picture the perfect location for a garden, I forgive you if your first thought was not somewhere near the arid climate of Fort Worth, Texas. This is an area which is famous for its cattle ranches, for its hot, dry summers, for its cold and also dry winters, for its sporadic hailstorms, occasional tornadoes, ice storms, and extended periods of drought. In fact, one of the only consistencies about the typically unpredictable weather here is that it is deeply inhospitable to all but the toughest plant life. The history of this area seemingly matches its weather. If the Wild West really did exist, then Parker County in particular was it. For decades, this area was the bleeding edge of the western frontier, synonymous with the Comanche Wars, the Texas Rangers, homesteaders, cattle drives, and wagon trains. Again, the local legends of this area would not necessarily suggest gardening as a primary feature. And yet, despite all of these factors, a quick 30-minute drive west of Fort Worth to nearby Weatherford, Texas, the seat of Parker County, somehow contains one of the most impressive gardens in the United States. At the end of a nondescript residential road, one that's so tucked away that some of the local residents don't even know it's there, lies a Chinese-style garden, replete with lush plant life, ornate water features, overhanging foliage, and deliberately contoured topography. The garden is beautiful by itself, but it is made all the more remarkable in its shocking contrast to the surrounding area. Now, that such a garden exists at all is intriguing by itself, but that only begins the story. This garden connects some of the most influential people of the 20th century, to include, among many others, Queen Elizabeth II, Winston Churchill, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and Herbert Hoover. It was the same man who brought this garden to life, utilizing his unique artistic genius, who likewise brought these famous individuals to life on canvas as one of the great portrait artists of all time. Today, we're going to take a look at a local hidden gem, Chandor Gardens in Weatherford, Texas.
And in New York, as one painter to another, Mr. Churchill takes a final look at his latest picture by artist Douglas Chandor.
Well, Mr. Churchill, I think this picture is just about finished, and I wish you'd come down and give me an idea of what you think of the thing.
All right, I will. Right. I think it's admirable, Mr. Chandor.
Well, that's most reassuring, Mr. Churchill. I believe I can fairly safely sign it now. There you are, Mr. Churchill. Signed, dated, and soon to be delivered.
Douglas Chandor was born in 1897 in England. Orphaned by his mother and abandoned by his father, Douglas's early life was marked by hardship. In 1914, Douglas lied about his age, like so many others, to serve in the British Army and fight in World War I. And after a severe bout of typhoid and a wound to his knee, he was discharged from service. And it was during this downtime that Chandor discovered he had a talent for drawing. He would sketch battle scenes and later portraits of the men he served with. And apparently, he showed enough aptitude in this hobby of his that he was later accepted to the prestigious Slade School of Art in London, where he studied under one of the great portrait artists of his day, Henry Tonks. Now, almost right away, Chandor was a professional success as an artist. He commissioned his first painting while still a student in 1919, and by 1920, he got his big break. He painted 2 portraits of the future King of England, King Edward VIII, who famously abdicated the throne to marry the American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Now, on paper, Chandor was a wealthy man. In a time where the average American household income hovered over just over $1,000 a year, Chandor reported a $35,000 contract with the Biddle family, for example, for just 5 portraits. This document here advertises from Chandor during that time that a full-size portrait would cost about $8,500, or adjusted for inflation by 2024 dollars, that would be about $150,000 today. Commissions were slowing down with the Great Depression, but Chandor got another big break when the sitting president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, commissioned Chandor to make a portrait of both him and his entire cabinet. Now, this would seem rather innocuous, except like most things with Herbert Hoover, it backfired in spectacular fashion. The first problem was that Chandor was English, which immediately upsets all the American artists, who then loudly complained to the media. The second big problem was that the Depression was starting to both deepen and make itself more permanent. Shantytowns were becoming known as Hoovervilles, and empty pockets were becoming known as Hoover flags. And this is the time that Herbert Hoover started to reconsider the image of him sitting for a lavish portrait while ordinary Americans were starting to suffer. That being said, though, the British Embassy put pressure on Herbert Hoover, who was starting to duck Chandor's telegrams for sittings. He kept putting it off and putting it off. Eventually, the portrait was completed in 1931, but by then, it was not a treasure, it was an embarrassment. It was shunted off to England. It was never sold. It remained in Chandor's possession for his entire life. Ironically, though, it now sits in the National Portrait Gallery. By 1968, all the controversy it had caused Hoover had been forgotten, and the Chandor estate sold it to the Smithsonian, and it now hangs in Washington, D.C. as the true and final representation of Herbert Hoover's presidency. And one might imagine the ambivalence Herbert Hoover might have to see that particular portrait hanging as a representation of his tenure. Now, Chandor's life would turn around dramatically in 1931. He attended a house party in Philadelphia thrown by the Biddle family, where he encountered a beautiful divorcee named Ina Koopman. Now, Ina Koopman was fascinating in her own right. She really needs her own video. But a couple things on her. She was a world traveler. She spent over a year living in Tahiti among the natives. She was also an athlete. She would be known to go out and hit 400 to 500 golf balls a day to keep up her stamina. And at the age of 40, she was seriously considering turning pro golf. Now, it was at this particular junction in her life that she ran into Douglas Chandor. And you got to imagine how opposite the two really seemed. Douglas Chandor referred to parties as that social stuff. It was a necessary evil to build up his business as an artist. Ina Koopman was part of the social scene. She was in the gossip columns. She was well known around town. And yet it was Douglas that approached Ina Koopman, who was wearing a backless dress. And apparently he said something to the effect of, "I have to paint your back." Now, whatever merits this has as a pickup line, I'll let you decide. It apparently worked, because Chandor married Ina in 1937, and he actually did paint her, as seen here. The couple later moved down to Weatherford, Texas, to live with Ina's mother. Ina is from Weatherford. And the couple split time between Weatherford and New York, balancing the needs of business and family. And Ina, in so many ways, really was the perfect complement to Douglas. Where Douglas could be spotty with his finances, Ina was the daughter of a banker and ran the business side of his life. Where Douglas was introverted and kept to himself, Ina was beautiful. She was charismatic. She used her charm and her connections to really keep Douglas's career alive during the downtimes of the Depression, later World War II. Now, in the 1930s, Chandor attended a poker game which began to turn around some of his fortunes. He met Elliott Roosevelt, who was the younger son of the sitting president, and a fast friendship formed between the two. and Chandor found himself attending Hyde Park. He painted Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and by the end of World War II, he was so in with the Roosevelts that he was commissioned to paint the Big Three from Yalta, as seen here. Now, the problem with this painting was that it was commissioned towards the end of World War II, but by 1946, when it was time to actually sit down for the painting, tensions in the Cold War had already built up, and so Stalin refused to sit for the painting. He certainly refused to visit the West to sit for the painting, and there was some talk maybe Douglas could go visit Moscow for short sittings, and that was also refused. So this painting went by the wayside, and it turned into a series of single portraits, first of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which was completed posthumously, and then later the very famous portrait of Winston Churchill in his military uniform. And contracts started to roll in very easily after this. Winston Churchill caused something of a stir in Little Weatherford as his DC-3 aircraft would land on the local airport, pick up Douglas and Ina, and fly them back either to Florida or to New York for a series of paintings. He later painted Eleanor Roosevelt the first time she'd agreed to sit for a portrait. He painted Governor James Cox, who paid Chandor, unsolicited, an extra $5,000 on top of their contract simply to build a mountain in his garden. More on that in a moment. In 1952, Chandor received the commission to paint the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, as seen here. Now, splitting time between Weatherford and London, the Queen's time, is obviously very valuable. Chandor needed a fill-in model to model for the Queen between her sittings. And it was at this time that Chandor approached Miss Eileen Colson Stringer to fill in for the Queen as a model, particularly for her hands, which Chandor was famously meticulous about. So it can be said, with some accuracy, that the Queen's hands live on in Texas today. Now, unfortunately, this would be Chandor's last major commission. He suffered an untimely stroke and died in 1953. Now, that alone would be an amazing story for a person's life, but I've unfortunately told this backwards. Chandor once remarked that God has a sole purpose for every person. And when Ina responded that this must be your great work as a painter, Chandor reportedly replied, quote, "No, Ina. God gave me the talent to paint pictures so I could sell them to get the money to build the garden." As we walk into Chandor's garden, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, try to picture the property before Chandor began gardening. His blank canvas looked something like this: arid, dry, and almost completely featureless. Secondly, remember that this is a garden of a painter. Chandor is deliberately anchoring your vision with obvious focal points and then adorning the background with beautiful scenery, much like one would do with a painting. Thirdly, note Chandor's extensive use of circular patterns. This serves two distinct purposes. First, it allows Chandor to make the garden beautiful from all angles, so no matter where the viewer moves, they have a different painting, so to speak. Secondly, avoiding sharp right angles creates the illusion that the garden is endless, making it feel much larger than it actually is. Chandor's garden is classified as a Chinese garden. To oversimplify a surprisingly complicated subject, gardens are a constant balancing act between the order of man and the chaos of nature. Order provides form, while chaos typically provides beauty. Western gardens tend to favor order. Think of highly manicured lawns or elaborately patterned flower beds. Asiatic gardens, particularly Japanese gardens, tend to favor wild aesthetics, with only the faintest touch of man's control. Classical Chinese gardens try to strike a balance between the two. You'll note here that Chandor's garden is far more wild than your standard English-style lawn, but he still demonstrates control through structures, walkways, and water features. As we move to the side of the home, we see one of the earliest sections of the garden. Note that these features are distinctly Western. This is a boxwood garden adjacent to Chandor's studio window. The statuette and the wall casting here would not be out of place in any European-style garden. Again, here's a classic English-style bowling green. In life, Chandor used it for bocce ball and croquet with his guests. Today, this is a popular spot for local weddings. Here we have an Irish-style pixie pond. Chandor clearly began his garden with what was familiar to him and branched out later on. As we head deeper into the garden, note the aesthetic change. Although Chandor Gardens is typically listed as Chinese style, the garden doesn't quite conform to any particular philosophy. This structure on our left is now known as Mount Cox. Governor James Cox, once a running mate with a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president, sat for his portrait in Weatherford. At the time, Chandor was building a mountain, practically stone by stone. The mountain might look native to the area, but there's absolutely nothing accidental in its design. Chandor described his plans to Cox, including plans to burn trash to make it look like a volcano. Cox was apparently impressed. Unsolicited, Cox sent Chandor an extra $5,000, writing simply to follow your dream. The mountain opened with a ceremony featuring Native Americans in headdress, and is described here to Governor Cox. As we move into the trellis pond, note how enclosed each section of the garden feels. Chandor referred to each part of the garden as rooms and treated each accordingly to its theme. Video simply doesn't do this next section justice, but if one stands in the moon gate, they can see all the way through the Chiling Fountain to the cave grotto beyond. Again, note the consistent structure in Chandor's choices. Like a painter, he understands how to draw the eye to catching aesthetics. This fountain, one of the last additions to the garden, is beautiful from every angle. If one thinks of Chandor Gardens as 1,000 little paintings, the genius of its creator can be fully appreciated. Chandor here employs forced perspective with his staircase. The bottom stairs are broader than the top, giving the impression the stairs are much taller than they actually are. This technique is perhaps most famously exemplified by Sleeping Beauty's castle in Walt Disney's parks. We finish our tour with Ina's walkway. Inscribed in Latin, Douglas writes, quote, "May this little garden flourish, consecrated to Ina." Chandor devoted his life and his garden to Ina, and in return, Ina dedicated her life to preserving Douglas's legacy by maintaining the garden. Chandor had originally named the estate White Shadows, and upon his passing in 1953, Ina renamed it Chandor Gardens. The gardens are listed as a Texas Historic Landmark, and also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But this place could not exist without the tireless efforts of the Chandor Gardens Foundation, who have expanded Douglas's vision to a place of art, music, history, and entertainment. As Douglas Chandor himself once stated, quote, "We ought to throw out old furniture very cautiously. It may turn out to be irreplaceable."